I wonder if you folks have seen what's in back of me here. Let me move my head. Can you see the flag? Now that's the official bicentennial flag, which, because you also have in front of you on the screen. And we are actually, as the bicentennial flag, we're kind of 1 year away past when we actually are celebrating, which is March 15th. We should be celebrating March 15th, 2020, but we all know what happened in March 2020. So many of the events and things that we had planned for that time, we actually even had a nice little dinner all planned with food you'd eat in 1820 and a little play with the selectmen and everything, never occurred. So some of this information we dug up at that time, and at other times we just said, well, you know, what can you do? But we still want to celebrate the bicentennial because Maine's becoming a state, a really important thing. So 1820, March 15th, 1820 was the day and year of statehood. Now, we don't often think much about the history or what was the background, what was going on in the coastal towns, how did the people vote? First, there are two steps to statehood, actually. The first is because we're not the state of Maine, we're the District of Maine, a part of Massachusetts, we got to get separated from Massachusetts. And then the second part is Congress, of course, has to accept us into statehood. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to take a look at what it was like end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and how things finally came together so that Maine could become the 23rd state in the Union. Now, first of all, I don't have everything here. First of all, let's take a look at the history prior to the vote in 1820. We go back, first of all, Sullivan, a coastal town, lots. Huh? You want to go to your map? Yes, I do. Okay, here we go. Sullivan at that time is much larger than it is today. Sullivan incorporated Warrant, which is presently has become Sorrento, and also encompassed all of Hancock. So that's a huge amount of territory, but that was Sullivan at that time. Later, much later, Sorrento breaks off, but only after statehood, only about 4 years later, about 1826, Hancock finally becomes a town. But at this very important time about looking at statehood and separation, this is what we've got. So being a coastal town, primarily, we're concerned late 1700s, early 1800s with shipping. We've got a lot of timber that wants to go to the other states. People in the other states are very willing to get the timber that we have. In fact, after a while, Sullivan proper, what we think of as Sullivan, was pretty much bare ground for quite a while because trees were just clear cut. And took a while for them to grow back. So we have people who are very involved in shipping. We have some of them are landowners of good tracts of land. About everybody's got 100 acres or so, because besides the shipping, there's some shipbuilding going on at this time. There are also people who are not involved with shipping, but who have land, who are settling, who are doing some farming, and perhaps working in the woods to cut timber. Some of the people, many people go to sea. Some of the people, of course, are sea captains, but not everybody can be a sea captain. There are a lot of workers. There are a lot of mariners we find as we look in the census material. So at this particular time, Sullivan has been through the Revolutionary War. That was a tough time because what happened is the British came in, they blockaded us, so we couldn't get our ships out into the seas. In fact, even in Sullivan proper, we lost 3 schooners, 2 fishing vessels, and 2 houses were burned down during that time. And that doesn't even count the number of times the British came ashore and went to the farmers and took their livestock, because British sailors need to eat. And so they would take the livestock and they would hassle the homeowners and so forth. And that was really, really a difficult time. Also at that time, it's important to think about Daniel Sullivan, who our town was named for, who had gotten up a militia so that the homeowners, property owners could get together and defend themselves, or in some cases actually travel to what was at that time called Bagaduce's Castine, travel down there because the British were there in full force. They got there a little late though, because it takes a while for people to get to Castine from Sullivan, especially in 1775. They also went over to Machias when the British were kind of harassing the Machias residents, because Machias was known as kind of a hotbed for revolution. And they were much more militant than our people were here in Sullivan. Actually, most of the people in Sullivan just wished this war wasn't happening. They really kind of just wished it would all go away. So when we think about separation from Massachusetts, there are some important factors that we have to take a look at. First of all, the people involved in shipping and had also probably a lot of property where there was timber. These were well-to-do people. These were well-to-do people who had a lot of connections in Massachusetts. Some had originally come from Massachusetts or in southern Maine, for example, York and Saco in that area. But before that, most of them had come from Boston. So they had a connection of family. They also had a commercial connection in that if you could get your goods down to Boston and you had a good agent down there, your goods could go to Europe or anywhere. And so there was this business commercial contact too. So obviously those people were not really looking at separation the same way as some people who are more recently settled. They also had a connection with Massachusetts in terms of religion. Many of them were Anglican Congregational, and they'd learned that in Massachusetts, and their families were old families that still practice religion, and an expected family to practice religion in the old way. Now, the newcomers, who were more recent, were a little different, a little more independent, not with the deep-rooted ties to a particular area. They were people who wanted to get on their own land, finally an opportunity to own some land, do some farming, take care of the children, take care of their animals. Maybe they weren't directly in contact with the people who were doing the shipping. And in 1775, we had, 1790, we had about 500 people in Sullivan altogether. This whole big area only had 500 people, which is not a whole lot of people when you look at it. So we've got the newcomers, a little more independent, a little different religious perspective, more Baptist, Methodist. And then we've got the people who are kind of at the top of the ladder, you might say. They've got the money, they've got the ships, they've got the whatever. The newer people, and especially people inland in Maine, were very much for separation. But all the coastal towns had similar history to Sullivan's at that time. So the people that did the shipping and had the ships did not want separation. Now that's what was going on with the people. And in the Revolutionary War, which I had just mentioned, with all that the British did, our people in Sullivan were very upset with the people in Massachusetts, with Congress and the legislature in Massachusetts, because they never did send anybody up to our area to protect our citizens and our property. And that just didn't strike a good note with folks, you know, if they didn't do that. And then if that wasn't bad enough, we get to the War of 1812. We just get out of the Revolutionary War. Population in Sullivan drops because a lot of people have had a bad experience. 1812 comes along. Now, the War of 1812, we've got the British back, and they don't really hit our area till about 1814, right around there, because they're busy doing other things around New York and whatever. But then they come up, they blockade the harbors again. They come into the farms again. They destroy buildings and whatever again in 1812. And where are the soldiers from Massachusetts? They're nowhere. They don't come up. Nothing happens. In fact, in 1800, Jabez Simpson, who's a Maine, one of the primary kind of movers and shakers in Sullivan, writes a petition signed by all the landowners. And he sends a petition to Massachusetts, and he begs them in this petition to help them with some financial help, because again, they lose ships. Ships can't sail. And they ask, won't you please help us and support us and so forth? And I don't know if he got a response, but it certainly couldn't have been much, because after the War of 1812, the people just were more inflamed with Massachusetts. They were more upset with Massachusetts, their own state, than they were with the British, which is interesting enough because, you know, we were really fighting the British. But that's what they were unhappy about, was lack of support from Massachusetts. And yet we paid taxes to Massachusetts. And so Massachusetts controlled a lot of our land, which was not already bought by proprietors at that point too. So there's this feeling of who wants to be with Massachusetts. In fact, the feeling was so strong that in 1780, people in Maine started conventions for separation. And that's 1785. And every year they met to work on how to get separation from Massachusetts. Well, that was pretty, that was all pretty interesting, but there was one other factor that was most important factor that really changed things. There was a vote. We had 6 votes totally towards separation. The first 2 votes were in the 1700s. And those first two votes, very few people voted. And it was almost kind of like a straw poll or something. I don't think people were really involved as much. But one of the big things that was a problem too with our wealthier people with the shipbuilding and the land and everything was there was a federal law called the coasting law. And the coasting law was established in 1789 by Congress. And in it, you needed to, if you were shipping, say a captain was leaving Sullivan with a load of lumber and they wanted to go to New Jersey. If we were an independent state and not a part of Massachusetts, every state the captain came to, he would have to go into the customs house, and pay a fee as he went past that state. And so for us, if we were independent under the coastal law, we'd have to go to New Hampshire or Massachusetts and Connecticut, New York, until we finally got to New Jersey. And so, I mean, you start out on course on your voyage, it's going to take you forever, twice as long to get to your destination because you keep going in and have to pay these fees. And we were the people who did the shipping felt like they did not want that to happen because as a District of Maine, a part of Massachusetts, we didn't have to pay any of those fees. Now, I'm not sure why exactly, but I've read quite a bit about this. And with being a part of the District of Massachusetts, no fees. You could take your load of lumber and go out to New Jersey and you wouldn't have to go into a port and back out again and so forth. So you can see the problem with that. There was no way that the ship owners or the people who were doing that commercial shipping were going to vote for separation because of business. It was business reasons why they wanted to keep it the way it was. Okay, so what happens though is, as luck would have it, a very interesting person entered the scene about that particular time. Oh, there's the shipping guys right there. There you go. And you're shipping out to New Jersey in this schooner with the 3 sails. Okay. Okay, what's happening is I got to take you to another one. William King. William King is becoming a part of these conventions for separation. So he's a very interesting man. They called him the Sultan of Bath because he was a poor boy growing up, but then he did real well and worked hard and owned a sawmill. And then he owned property. And then he got into shipping. And then he owned a lot of land. And then he was in the Maine legislature. So he did very well. He was a separatist. They were called separatists if they wanted to separate from Massachusetts. Another really important thing about William King is he had an older half brother called Rufus. Now, Rufus was a lawyer from New York. So we know we're really serious now if we've got a lawyer from New York, right? Rufus actually was in the Congress itself as a senator, as a representative. He actually signed the Constitution of the United States. So William is looking at all this stuff. He's a strong separatist. He wants separation to come 1814, 1815, 1860. He starts gearing up. And he talks to Rufus to get support and to just discuss the politics of the day, because William knows there's no way we're going to separate from Massachusetts as long as we have the coasting law. Well, what happens then is that late in October in 1818, William and Rufus have an appointment with the treasurer of the union. And the treasurer, of course, can regulate the laws, the procedures around this coasting law. So they go right to the horse himself, right from the horse's mouth or whatever. That's not, doesn't fit right there, does it? What can I say? So they go to see him and plead their case. We're never going to get separated from Massachusetts and be a state unless there's a change in the coasting law. Well, it obviously worked, because the next year, 1819, out comes a brand new revised coasting law. And it says no ships have to stop at every state and pay in the customs house. We got it. So that really worked. Rufus and William had quite a bit of influence. They also had a lot of experience. So this definitely paid off. So then William feels now it's time to vote again. And what happens is there's going to be a final vote. And that final vote is in 1819. And here's, let's see. Okay, this is what this looks like. This is a warrant by the town, and it contains information. The selectmen at this time that have put this warrant out are Jabez Simpson, Robert Mercer, and George Hinman. And what it says is that, okay, voters, we're required in the name of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to notify the inhabitants of said town of Sullivan as such that are qualified to vote. No women, no Native Americans, right? You guys don't count. So those that are qualified to vote, the men that own property. On the question, is it expedient that the District of Maine shall become a separate and independent state upon the terms and conditions provided in an act entitled An Act Relating to Separation of the District of Maine from Massachusetts proper and forming this same district a separate and independent state. And they tell the constable to go out and post this, no social media, right? No radio, no TV, no whatever. So this is posted. And for Sullivan, that means going over to the Hancock side, what becomes Hancock, going down to Warkeg Neck, making sure everybody knows this and establishing this. So this brings up an important point, because in order to vote, you can see how we're set up. We got a bunch of peninsulas here, and there's water all over the place. So where do the people come vote? Well, Sullivan is the town. So all the people have to come vote in Sullivan. And so they have to come over on the ferry. So with that warrant, they have to establish a time when the tide is just right so the ferry can get over. Now, Warkeg Neck, you can get to Sullivan, although some of them probably had boats that they used. But over in Hancock, what is now Hancock, they were very, very active in the politics of the town. And so there were a number of people from Hancock that would be involved with everybody else. So you had to plan your vote for when the ferry could pick you up, when the tide was in the right position, get over there and vote. And you went to what is called the Tidewater Point. And the meeting house was at Tidewater Point. So you get off the ferry, go into the meeting house, do your vote. There'd be some business with that too. And make sure you got back on that ferry at the right tide. So you know, there's a lot of talk in the news today about new rules and regulations around voting and how we have to make sure that everybody is able to get their vote. If you're at home and you're immobile, you can mail in your vote or just such and such or whatever. But this is what they went through to do their vote back in 1820. And that ferry actually ran for quite a while. The one like it ran for quite a while. You can see the fellow's got the pole there in his hands. So he probably pushes it off. Sometimes there was a cable that went across, and with the cable that would help him keep from going over the falls this way or whatever. But there are a lot of pictures of the ferries, and that's I think is a pretty interesting one too. So the vote passed. That final 6 vote passed. Did it pass in Sullivan? No, never did. But we've got another slide to take a look at. And this shows you how the votes went, the yays and the nays. Remember I was telling you about the first 2 votes, the 1700s might as well have been straw votes. Very few people came out. 1807, it picked up someone. It's always heavy on the nay side, right? I mean, some of these farmers that really couldn't leave their farms over in Hancock or whatever, or, you know, it would be very difficult to vote. But the people in Sullivan, what we think of Sullivan today, it'd be a lot easier to get to Tidal Falls than it was for these folks. But then things begin to change in May of 1816, September 1816. And then, of course, here's our final vote that we saw the warrant of. 30 yeas, 33 nays. That's the closest the vote ever came to passing in Sullivan. And while the state vote, it passed, of course, because 17,000 yeas, 7,132 nays. And that last vote is the last vote that Hancock, Lincoln, and Washington voted yay. The only time they voted yay was on that very last vote when the coasting law got revised. So we can see what happened there. Now, we've got separation, but we don't have statehood yet. So what happens is then I want to talk a little bit about the Constitution. That's on my other note. So there is a constitutional convention in 1819. We got to write a new constitution for the state of Maine. George Hinman, one of our folks, was a delegate to the 1819 Constitutional Convention. And that state constitution was approved by vote in December of 1919. And the vote was very, very strong for the Constitution. A couple of things about the Constitution that I think are interesting. One is they based the Constitution on the Massachusetts Constitution. Now, for example, the Massachusetts Constitution states there will be freedom of the press. But the Maine Constitution says there will be freedom of the press and speech. You can see that difference there. In Maine, we're getting, with our Constitution, more rights than in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts also I'm sorry, I don't have all my notes right here, and so I'm blocking senior moment. Huh?
Religion.
Yeah, freedom of religion. The Mass Constitution definitely discriminated against Roman Catholics, Jews. The Maine Constitution stated that all faiths are appropriate or not appropriate, but all faiths are accepted, for example. So it didn't stipulate, gee, you got to be white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Which is more or less what Massachusetts was saying. So these early rights in terms of Maine, I think are really important, that people could see ahead and look around and really make some definite changes for us here in Maine. So then, as I said, the Constitution was accepted. So Massachusetts lets Maine go. I think we have to pay them quite a bit of money too, but that's what happens in these deals, I guess. And now it's time to become a state. You all remember your high school history. Maine became the 23rd state in the Union, while Missouri came in at the same time. Maine comes in as a free state, no slavery. Missouri comes in as a slave state to balance it off, because that's what Congress was doing at that time. The separatists in Maine, who so wanted to be a state and had struggled through those separation votes and everything, so much wanted Maine to be a free state, but they were very opposed to the spread of slavery anywhere in this country. And so many of them had strong discussions about maybe not going for statehood at this time. Maybe this isn't the time, because, to encourage slavery was not what this state wants. But they did accept the compromise. Another reason they did was that when they separated from Massachusetts, Massachusetts did some legislation that encouraged Maine to separate if the voters approved separation. But they only gave a limited period of time to Maine to do this, or they would be back again as a district of Maine and a part of Massachusetts. So they felt that time was a really important thing. They hated to do the compromise on the whole, but they did to become a free state. March 15th, 1820, Maine becomes a state. So I'm going to show you. Oh, wrong guy. There we go. These are resources that I have used in order to be able to present this. And the first one that you can see, Maine becomes a state, the movement to separate Maine from Massachusetts, I didn't get the rest of it written in, is by Roland Banks, a professor at University of Maine, Orono. Really good book, really sums things up well. Oh, okay, that should go with that. Stephanie Bouchard, she wrote for the Island Journal, which is put out by the Island Institute once a year. Maine Triumphs Through the Coastal Law. That's a really good article. In fact, the journal is a really good journal. That's why Rain is with us, because of the Island Institute, not because of the article, but because of the Island Institute. And then we have the Sullivan Town Reports. Unfortunately, Picton Press is no longer with us. So the CDs are no longer available, and it's almost impossible to. We do have them and digitized, but they're not available for people to buy in case they want to do some research. This last one, a neighbor of mine, that's Barbara Cunningham, Barbara Potter, has William Williamson, History of the State of Maine. Check it out, 1832 it was published, 2 volumes. So it gave a report right right there practically. I mean, 20 years later, 22 years later, it was really quite the books. They're really something. So there we are in terms of the sources of information, and that's our history hour for today.
Discussion.
And now we'll have some discussion. If people have questions,